I do want to advise the Chair, Mr. Speaker, that if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to immediately bring up H.R. 336, the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act of 2019, with an amendment that will make it identical to S1, which passed the Senate in a bipartisan vote of 77 to 23 earlier this year. This bill includes many critical provisions, but most important sections of this bill is Combating BDS Act of 2019, which would allow a state or local government to adopt measures to divest assets from entities using boycotts, divestments, or sanctions to influence Israel's policies. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, the House passed H.Res. 246, a non-binding resolution opposing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And while I appreciate the House's action in passing that resolution, we can do better in opposing this heinous practice than simply passing a non-binding resolution. Actions speak louder than words. We cannot just say we believe in something, we must do something. H.R. 336 would do something. It would allow a state or local government to stand with us in defense of Israel. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record, along with the extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my good friend, the distinguished representative from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, for further explanation of this amendment.
Without objection, the gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my good friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole. H.R. 336, the Strengthening America's Security Act in the Middle East Act, is the House companion to S1. This bill was so important that the United States Senate made it their top legislative priority and passed it with overwhelming bipartisan support. H.R. 336, a bill introduced by Ranking Member McCall, combines 4 various policy initiatives that deal with the United States-Israel relationship. This legislation authorizes assistance and weapons transfers to Israel. It extends defense cooperation with Jordan and establishes additional sanctions on individuals supporting the Syrian government. Most importantly, this bill allows states to divest from entities that are boycotting Israel. Just this week, the House passed with bipartisan support a resolution opposing the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, also known as BDS. That resolution was a great stepping stone, but we need to do more. Now we must pass legislation with some teeth. There's no doubt that Israel is our greatest ally in the Middle East and is the only Jewish state. Since her birth 71 years ago, the U.S.-Israel relationship has continued to grow stronger as we find new means for cooperation and ensure the safety of her and her people. It's time for the Democrat leadership to bring this crucial bill to the House floor for a vote. It's vital for all of us to come together and show our support for Israel. It's not solely Republican and not solely Democrat. We must continue to come together as a unified body to stamp out anti-Semitism and hate towards the only Jewish state, Israel. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I would just say to my friend, Mr. Kustoff, he and I served together on financial services, and there's agreement here. In fact, this resolution that he described as a great stepping stone, we just took and passed the resolution 2 days ago with 398 aye votes in favor of that. Today, though, we're here to focus on 2 other things, both of which are substantial measures in and of themselves, and we can look forward to other measures involving the BDS, anti-BDS movement or whatever we may be, but to deal with anti-Semitism. But today, we're here really to applaud a deal that was cut among all of our leaders, Democrats and Republicans, that eliminates drastic cuts approves funding or funding levels for the next year to 2 years and allows America to move forward without the real potential of shutdown like we had for 35 days when the White House earlier in this year refused to deal on certain subjects and appropriations. Thankfully, we got through that. I think at this point, cooler heads have prevailed, and we are moving forward on the Bipartisan Budget Act. And then, as Ms. Shalala said, we're dealing with really a humanitarian crisis that exists in Venezuela at this point to provide temporary protected status to those who fled their country, who are in America, many of whom are in Florida, to provide them some protection while they're here and to make sure that they can comfortably, if you will, remain here and not fear that they're going to have to be deported back to Venezuela, where we know there's a lot of strife and danger. And I don't have any other speakers, and I'm going to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just briefly, I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I agree with my friend very much. These two pieces of legislation are excellent and they're must-pass, and I look forward to working with him on that. But this is such an extraordinary outbreak of bipartisanship. I think we should go for broke and bring up this other legislation as well, which is equally bipartisan, as my friend says. I don't want to waste this magic moment, Mr. Speaker. We don't get many of them around here. And with that, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to my good friend, the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the rule, urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so that the House may take up H.R. 336, a bipartisan legislative package that would help fight back against the BDS movement, protect U.S. security in the Middle East by strengthening our alliances with Israel and Jordan, and sanction nefarious actors like Assad. The Senate version of this bill, S1, passed with an overwhelming bipartisan majority of 77 to 23. Surprisingly, the major point of contention for this package is the Combating BDS Act of 2019, a bipartisan bill that garnered over 100 co-sponsors last Congress that would help combat the BDS movement. It is okay to have reasonable, legitimate concerns with any government in the world, including our own. But this hate-filled movement is not all about affirming the rights of the Palestinians, as some suggest. It is about delegitimizing Israel by turning it into a pariah state cut off from all trade, tourism, military, diplomatic, and cultural ties with the rest of the world. BDS, whose founder was blatantly anti-Semitic, amounts to a declaration of economic war against Israel with the goal of destroying it as the only Jewish state on earth. I hear of college students all across our entire country who share personal, very personal testimonials of how they are being targeted with blatant anti-Semitism in the name of BDS. Thankfully, this week, the House passed House Resolution 246, a resolution to forcefully condemn the BDS movement. Making a strong statement is great and should be celebrated. But we should wake up the next morning asking ourselves, challenging each other to what we can do about it. S1 has already passed the Senate, but it's not being brought up in this House despite nearly 200 members signing the discharge petition and over 100 co-sponsors last Congress. This bill does not impede the right of any individual American to boycott or criticize Israel, as some suggest. Instead, H.R. 336 would combat the BDS movement by simply allowing state and local governments to have the right to counter the BDS movement by ending contracts with companies that boycott Israel, if they so choose, while protecting U.S. security in the Middle East. There were 350 co-sponsors on the statement that was made earlier this week. There were nearly 400 votes on the House floor. Republicans and Democrats worked together through a process from drafting the legislation to getting the bill marked up at committee to passing on the House floor, and we should celebrate making a great statement. Now we should be passing a bill with teeth. We could do it right now. And if this bill gets added to the voting before we leave here this week, I guarantee it passes. So not only did we earlier this week make a strong statement to combat the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic BDS movement, but we woke up the next day motivated to actually challenge ourselves to do something about it, and we got it done. The one thing that's concerning is that we keep asking for a vote on H.R. 336, and we're not getting an answer in response as to why it's not coming up for a vote or when it will come up for a vote. And I would challenge anyone who has an answer to this question to please let us know, because we don't know what else to do other than bringing up today's proposal, for example. But if this is something that's already passed the Senate with a strong bipartisan majority, it's the right thing to do. We've almost unanimously condemned the BDS movement, and we're here on the House floor together with a bill that would pass strongly. Let's get it done. Let's get it done right now. There's a lot of people who would celebrate that big win. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I yield myself so much time as I may consume, and I just want to continue to focus on what's before us today. And what's before us today is dealing with a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and dealing with the budget of the United States of America, two accomplishments, both bipartisan, that I think will really assist and protect so many people who fled Venezuela to America, and particularly to Florida, but also provides for funding caps that help us with veterans, with infrastructure, with foreign affairs, across the board, our military. The President tweeted the other day that this was the Bipartisan Budget Act was a real accomplishment for veterans and our military, and I agree. I'm sorry that Mr. Zeldin and Mr. Cole would like to bring up something else. In fact, I was fortunate enough to be in the chair when the BDS bill and the resolution H.R. 246, I think it was being debated and passed by an overwhelming majority, and really was a huge accomplishment, which I'm afraid the arguments that the gentleman's making now minimize what was accomplished just 2 days ago. So I think we need to remain focused on these major pieces of legislation that will guide America for the next 2 years and will protect Venezuelans who fled their country for at least 18 months. And so with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield an additional 2 minutes to my good friend from New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentleman who just spoke for expressing his gratitude and his celebration for what passed earlier this week. And I appreciate his support for what passed earlier this week. And I would actually suggest that doing something about that statement that we made is not minimizing the statement that we made. It's actually maximizing the statement that we made. We're minimizing the statement that we made if we wake up the next day and decide that we're not going to do anything about it by passing a bill with teeth. And again, I would ask anyone who has an answer to this question, when can we have a vote on S1 and H.R. 336? It's a simple question. I don't have the answer to it. But if anyone can answer that for us, it would really help those who genuinely, sincerely, passionately believe in this legislation and know from my conversations with colleagues on the opposite side of the aisle, I know of a number of colleagues who would enthusiastically vote for S1 H.R. 336. And I know of friends, colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have asked for a vote on S1 H.R. 336. And now would be a good opportunity. I don't know if, I don't want to put the gentleman on the spot, but if anybody can answer that question, we're very interested in having a vote scheduled on this bill. But let's maximize the statement that we made by adding that it will pass and it'll go to the president, it'll be signed into law, and we'll celebrate not only a strong statement made, but maximizing that strong statement made by doing something about it and passing a bill with teeth. I yield back.
Goes back to balance of time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
I'd advise my friend I'm prepared to close whenever he is.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time. I want to begin by thanking my colleague for a good debate and, frankly, for both of us having the enjoyable and unusual position of being in favor of both the pieces of legislation that are dealt with in the rule. I want to go back and talk just briefly about the Venezuela TPS legislation that our good friend and our fellow Rules Committee member, Ms. Shalala, that's an important piece of legislation. That's an important statement of American principles. And I think it's an important institutional moment for us as the House, because I think we're passing something jointly to try and get the other body to do something jointly as well. Because I'm quite convinced if that got to the floor, it would pass in a very substantial bipartisan ways. And so I'm glad to work with my friends to achieve this. I suppose I'm even more pleased about the Bipartisan Budget Act. And I want to, again, congratulate the 5 leaders on both sides of the aisle who actually got this done. The President of the United States sat down and negotiated this. We have a lot of people on my side of the aisle that are big supporters of the President of the United States. I hope they show that support today by actually voting for the deal that he negotiated and has tweeted out that he supports. But I want to congratulate in our own chamber the Speaker and the Republican leader, Ms. Pelosi and Ms. McCarthy, for also participating in that and working together. And I know each one of them had to go back to their caucuses and probably deliver some news that people in those caucuses did not want to hear. That's certainly true on our side of the aisle. I know it's true on my friend's side of the aisle as well. That's what leaders do. They come to agreements and they go back and they explain to their supporters, hey, I couldn't get you everything you wanted, even though I wanted those things too. But every now and then, you need to sit down and put what's good for the American people first. We all know that a catastrophic debt ceiling crisis and default, what that would do to our economy, how many people that would put out of work. We all know what having an agreed upon deal in terms of stability going forward for 2 years means for the American military, but for every other agency of government as well. These are huge, huge wins, even at some sacrifice. Now, would I like to do some more on deficit reduction and entitlement reform? I absolutely would. We'll continue to work on that. But anytime I can come to an agreement that saves the economy, that provides government stability, that gives our military the ability to plan and to rebuild itself over a 2-year period, and that the Commander-in-Chief is asking me to do, I'm going to vote for that every single time. And I'm very proud to be voting for it with my friends on the other side of the aisle, who also, again, had objectives in this that they weren't able to reach. Finally, it'd be remiss for us, and I do this as seldom as possible, but I will praise the United States Senate, because the majority leader and the minority leader were also indispensable in getting this done. And in many ways probably came to an agreement between themselves faster even than the other parties involved. But at the end of the day, again, both of those leaders, the majority leader and the minority leader in the Senate, had to go back and tell their caucuses, look, this is the best deal I can get. I'm not going to get everything I want. We're not going to achieve everything we'd like to achieve. And again, I respect my colleagues who look at the deal and say that's not good enough. That's fine, but you tell me what's better that you can get passed. And I see no alternative to this particular piece of legislation that is not worse. The worst thing to do would be to defeat this bipartisan budget agreement and then deal with sequester or a debt crisis or a shutdown or at best a CR that would project these quarrels forward into the next year. It's already a pretty tense political time between all sides. The fact, again, that we're coming together and making a bipartisan agreement really reflects well on our respective leaders on each side of the aisle and certainly on the President. And I think if the members will vote in a bipartisan fashion, it will reflect well on them and on the institution as well. So I know some doubted that we could ever work together. I think this is the most significant thing we have done together this year. And I just want to thank all concerned, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to supporting it enthusiastically I hope others of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle do the same. And with that, I would, while I oppose the rule, I would certainly urge the passage of both these important pieces of legislation and look forward to working with my friends in that regard and yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Colorado is
I
recognized.
yield myself such time as I may consume. And I thank my friend from Oklahoma. I almost thought he was going to support the rule. I just felt it was moving in that direction, but not quite. But I do want to thank him, and particularly I think the 35 days that we were in shutdown mode at the beginning of this year, there were a lot of hard lessons learned by a lot of people. And there were a lot of people who suffered, and starting with the people that needed assistance in one way or another by federal employees who were, in effect, sitting at home waiting for us to open the government again. And so I'm very pleased, and I'd say to my friend, I think that hard lesson, and we met pretty much every night in the Rules Committee, the Appropriations Committee, my friend's an appropriator, that was something that weighed heavy on all of us. And I do want to applaud the Republicans and the Democrats, our leadership, and the White House in coming up with a compromise. And I know there will be some on my side that will not support this for a variety of reasons. And I know there will be some on Mr. Cole's side as well, but hopefully we can garner enough support, and I think it'll be strong support today, for both of these pieces of legislation that are brought up under the rule. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleagues for joining me to speak on the rule and these pieces of legislation. The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 549, the Venezuelan TPS Act, which we already know is supported by a bipartisan majority in this House. We also need and must pass H.R. 3877, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019. This legislation will raise the debt ceiling for 2 years and increases discretionary spending caps for fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021. The deal achieves parity between increases in defense and non-defense spending and lets the House and the Senate get back to negotiation all of the appropriations bills so that Congress can fulfill its constitutional duty of funding the government. As we look ahead to the next several weeks, which we will spend in our districts visiting with constituents and touring local businesses, I look forward to sharing with my constituents that despite our disagreements and everything that they may see on TV, we can still come together and get things done on behalf of America. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I encourage a yes vote on the rule and the previous question. I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman yields that the question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, on that I would request the yeas and nays.
The gentleman from Oklahoma has requested the yeas and nays. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.